Ana, Erlina, Felipe, y Nico, bienvenidos a Token Theater Friends. It's a pleasure to have all of you here today. I think this is like the biggest episode I've done in quite some time, and I'm so happy that it's with fellow Latine people. So I am very excited to talk to all of you about the musicals that you're going to be presenting at the 4X Latiné at Latiné Musical Theatre Lab. So I want to know a little bit about what your shows are about, who you are, and where you are in the world. So, Ana.
Hola, my name is Ana Deeny Morales. I am the librettist of Zavala, Zavala, an opera in 5 cuts. The composer is Brian Ariola. So Zavala, Zavala, an opera in 5 cuts is based on the first family separation case in El Paso, Texas, that was part of the Trump administration's pilot program in 2017. So basically, the administration ran this pilot program in order to test the efficacy of, like, basically, if people would go through with separating children from their families at the border. And so this case is the first separation case that was for Sergio Garcia, who was the defense attorney in the case. And it's the case in which he realizes that children are being separated from their families at the border.
Hi, my name is Erlina Ortiz, pronouns she, her. I am the book writer and co-lyricist of Siluetas. My partner on the project is Robbie Hager, who's the composer and co-lyricist. And Siluetas is about displacement, home, immigration, community, friendship, forgiveness. It is about a Cuban-American woman who has been ripped from her home and ancestry at a very young age of 16. And when the musical begins, she is leaving a bad marriage of 20 years and starting anew. So it's all about her kind of finding herself, finding her way back home, reconnecting with her ancestral lineage and her connections, and building a new home with the community that she finds in Philadelphia, where she moves after her divorce from her 20-year marriage. So yeah, that's a little bit about Siluetas.
Hello, everyone. My name is Felipe. I'm here in New York City. And I'm the book writer and the lyricist of Divergentes, un musical diverso. And Divergentes is the choral story of 7 characters who experience the difficulty of living and settling in a world where social, moral, and cultural labels determine the way you have to be and express yourself. So these characters are trying to find how to be themselves in a good way, of course. I like to say that as a writer, I think Divergentes is a very big, very good picture of the Latin American culture. So I'm very excited to be part of this festival that allowed me to show this excerpt.
Hola, Jose. Hola a todos. A long-time listener, first-time caller of the podcast. So I'm very excited to be here. My show, Como Correr, is a rap concert trapped inside a musical that thinks it's a cartoon. It follows 2 Latin high schoolers who fall in love in the middle of the time in 2016 where we were pre-Trump and MAGA was kind of rising and Black Lives Matter was sort of coming up at the same time. So it sort of asks the question if their sort of young queer love can last in this terrible moment that we all lived through.
I'm so happy because I actually just got home from watching The Little Mermaid. And, you know, like, as you know, Lin-Manuel Miranda co-wrote some of the new songs in it. And other than Lin-Manuel Miranda, really, like, there's not a lot of Latina representation in musical theater, especially in the US. So I'm just so happy to be in community with all of you here today. So what made you fall in love with musicals?
Yeah, it's funny that I'm working on a musical. This is my first musical that I'm working on, and I'm seeing some like support on there. I was definitely a musical theater kid. So starting from, kindergarten, I think is when I first did my first like little, pretending to play guitar on stage in front of my parents' show. And then theater was kind of always my thing. And then high school, of course, you know, the school that I went to, we did one show a year and it was always a musical. I think we did Pippin, we did The Wiz, we did South Pacific. And then one year we actually did High School Musical, which was a really fun. It was like the year that like after High School Musical came out on Disney, and then we were doing High School Musical. So I think that was like when the obsession became a little bit more intense, because it was just like so meta. But then once I actually started pursuing a professional theater career, I very much left musicals behind for a while. Because I'm not a singer and I don't consider myself a musically gifted person. Like I don't play any instruments really. And so I always kind of felt like I don't have the skills to actually work on a musical. And also musicals to me were like old, like not contemporary. It was like boring, like, you know, I don't want to do that anymore. I want to do contemporary present work. That started to shift when I learned about In the Heights when I was already like in my early 20s. And then with the whole Hamilton craze, it was a little bit more of like, oh, maybe musicals can be something contemporary. And that I realized that even though I don't have always the language for communicating when it comes to musicals, a lot of times it's about the feeling. And that's something that I have been able to work really well with my collaborator, Robbie, on, is that sometimes I don't know like how to say, make this a C instead of an A or whatever it is. But I can be like, I don't know, it should feel like more like instead of and he like knows what I mean. And so I think that in a way, not having that professional training has created a different language for us that works really well. So yeah, I guess that's kind of like the journey of it a little bit.
Rock and roll, yeah. Well, Erlina, I also did High School Musical in school. I was Ryan in high school, my junior year. But anyway, my mom, speaking of Disney musicals, my mom at a very young age indoctrinated me into the cult that is the Disney musical VHS. So like Aladdin, Lion King, Snow White, Cinderella, Tarzan, all those were in constant rotation in my home. And then in middle school, I found The Nightmare Before Christmas, and that was one that I was sort of really able to like reach into and like connect with, despite being terrified of the Oogie Boogie Man. I was still like, this is still really cool, but I can't watch this part or I'll cry. And then my drama teacher in high school kind of like plucked me out of the crowd and was like, you should be doing this. You have too much energy that should be placed somewhere. And then I just started doing musicals in there, and I found Rent in high school, and I was like, this connects with my teenage angst. And it was really the what's her name? Who is Mimi's bridge on Out Tonight, where she like kind of gets into it and the Spanish babies are crying. I was like, I feel so seen in this. And like that sort of was like felt really contemporary to me. I mean, despite it like, you know, I guess at this point being a period piece, I was sort of really into how the queerness and the people of color and the raw emotionality of it was sort of all sort of pushed to the forefront. And then I went to a STEM school and studied theater at a STEM school in Florida. They were cutting the budget of the theater program while giving $2 billion to the dental program. But what was good about that is that nobody was watching us, so we could kind of do whatever we wanted. It was just like a great little sandbox for like weird Christopher Durang plays and like student works and creativity. And then from there, I went to, I just graduated from NYU's Graduate Musical Theater Writing Program, which is cool. And I'm so happy to be here in community with y'all Latin people, because no shade to the Graduate Musical Theater Writing Program, but there weren't that many Latin people there. And I sort of feel that language barrier. Erlina, I feel you with that, like, it comes from like an emotional place for me, as opposed to like, this needs to be a C sus2 and then we're gonna go into an E major 7. It's more like, nah, this needs to feel like a panic attack, or this needs to feel like a flower blooming and that kind of thing. So I still, and this show Como Correr is my first musical as well, so I still feel like I have so much to learn, but like, I'm just happy to be here. If my eyes are just wide, just swallowing all the information. It's so cool, yeah.
So, para mí, el entrar en el mundo de los musicales creo que viene desde que era niño. Cuando me acuerdo, tengo muy presente, cuando era muy niño, estar en la casa con mi mamá y ella tomaba su guitarra y empezaba a cantar conmigo, tratando de enseñarme cómo cantar y que cantara con ella. Creo que desde esos momentos empezó a gustarme mucho la música. La música fue parte de mí desde muy pequeño. Yo primeramente soy performer, soy actor, soy cantante, y Divergentes es mi tercer musical que yo he escrito, pero básicamente yo soy actor, entonces yo todo lo que escribo lo escribo como actor, como pensando en cómo lo va a hacer en los personajes, entonces yo empiezo a actuar todos los personajes, eh, y veo cómo se pueden relacionar, en fin, como que me meto en cada uno. Creo que igual uno, aunque no tenga experiencia de actor, uno como escritor también hace ese trabajo, a lo mejor inconscientemente, pero aunque sé mucho de música como cantante, porque canto, no tengo las herramientas para poder, por ejemplo, componer o para poder crear yo solo un musical. Entonces, siempre pensé que a lo mejor cuando era más pequeño, cuando era adolescente, por ejemplo, siempre quise escribir musicales, pero siempre decía, nunca lo voy a poder hacer porque no tengo las herramientas para hacerlo. Porque vivía en Chile y allá en Chile hay ¿cómo se llama? Una industria de musicales que es muy pequeña, que es muy, muy pequeña, entonces no se sabe mucho, yo no sabía mucho cómo funcionaba este mundo. Entonces, al venirme para acá, a vivir acá a Nueva York, se me abrió toda esa posibilidad y supe que había, o sea, lo sabía de antes, pero me di cuenta desde el momento que había en situ, digo, habían personas especializadas en componer la música y que tú podías a lo mejor trabajar sin tener las cualidades. Entonces, simplemente como tratando de sacar todo eso que está en ti y ponerlo en la página. Así que, nada, estoy muy contento con Divergentes, la verdad.
I think my story is more like Felipe in that music and this is something I've done since I was a little girl. My mom in the 70s was part of the formation of the theater company here in DC called Gala Hispanic Theater, whose artistic director, Hugo Medrano, very unfortunately just passed away. And so I, have known Hugo and his partner, Rebecca Medrano, since I was a little girl because I was at their rehearsals. And the one I remembered most was Yerma. So my mom is Puerto Rican, and she came here in the late 60s, and she worked in theater. But then later on, she became a public school teacher here in this area. But she always continued to work in theater as a performer, but then also as a writer. So she's a poet, but she didn't read her poetry. She would always perform her poetry. So rehearsals, ella recitaba su poesía. So rehearsals and writing and teaching were like the bread and butter. They were the foundation of our family. So like now my sister's a public high school teacher. Do you know who plays the guitar? But then I'm trained as a classical pianist. So that was always a big part of my life. And I always really loved languages. And so I remember when I first saw the movie Amadeus, which you guys don't remember, like that was when I hit middle school. And I heard this line that Mozart said he wanted his operas to be in German, not in Italian. And that really struck me. I was like, why? What's going on there with his relationship to that language? And so I was already taking French. My mom didn't let us speak English in our house. She said we couldn't eat if we spoke in English. She would only feed us if we spoke in Spanish. And so I was like, but now I got to learn German because I got to see what's going on with this language. And so anyway, in the meantime, my parents would send us, my sister and I, to spend our summers in Puerto Rico with our grandparents. And we were partially raised by our grandparents. And that's when my grandfather, who actually didn't read music, but he played by ear, he trained my sister and I in Caribbean musical traditions. And his mom had, even though she had had 12 children, she used to perform and sing in zarzuelas in Puerto Rico. At the beginning of the 20th century, Puerto Rico had like 10 opera/zarzuela companies. The importance of that is that we think that this isn't our tradition, you know, like, and now I'm really talking about the operatic tradition. But zarzuela is similar to the musical tradition, to the US musical tradition, because zarzuelas are a Spanish tradition, and there were thousands of zarzuelas written in Spain between the 19th and the early 20th century. And this musical tradition was taken up in Latin America. And they were cranked out. Zarzuelas were cranked out, and they were works that were sung and spoken. And they were often comical. Many were performed in one evening. So this was a really lively tradition. And it's part of our tradition as Latiné people throughout the Americas. Like, there were troops that traveled all over the border regions, the Caribbean, all the way down to Argentina and up to places like New York City. And through Chile. Chile has a great zarzuela tradition that they suppress. Like, my Chilean friends are like, oh, there's no, and I'm like, no, actually, yes. So that's my background, you know, like music, poetry, a formal tradition, like a formal classical tradition, but also like more informally learning a Caribbean tradition are just part of my foundation. But I have to say, I was remembering something when we were speaking, and it's something I always suppress. When I was applying to go to graduate school, I was either going to go in one direction or another, go on to do my PhD and really deeply study Latin American literature, or I was going to go to the Yale School of Drama. And I was a finalist at the Yale School of Drama. And I'll never forget, they said at the end of the interview, do you have any questions for us? And I said, yeah. Do you guys, and this was like, you know, in my 20s. Yeah. Do you guys study Latin American, or at the time we would say Latino theater? And the response was, here at the Yale School of Drama, we study a traditional theater, you know, tradition. So that was Shakespeare, who I love, you know, like I grew up, I adore Shakespeare, I adore Beckett, you know, I love this tradition, but so that was the response I got. And it really, I had also, after college, I went to study theater in Italy and at the Accademia Nazionale d'Arte Drammatica there, you know, so I was this amalgam, you know, like this kid who was born here, who grew up in the Latino theater of Gala Hispanic theater here, between here and Puerto Rico, speaking these languages, you know, like with all these wrapped around trees inside of me. And I didn't find a place where I could bring that together. And then, so I took the academic route, and I went on and I got a PhD and I started teaching. The thing that I always did along the way also was I started translating poetry, and I translate a lot of Chilean poetry, Felipe. So like Raúl Zurita, Gabriela Mistral, Nicanor Parra. So I really started working very deeply in language and sound in poetry until several years ago. This woman who's Chilean, who is the founder of an opera company here in DC called the In Series, which is the oldest small opera company here in DC. She invited me to adapt an operetta, a zarzuela that was Cuban from the early 20th century. And I was like, yeah, I can do that. Do you know, like I had the tools in this dusty toolbox that I took out, and then I found my home. Do you know, like when you guys talk about your childhood, and I did all of that. I worked in musical theater. So it's taken a long time. And I think when you have different backgrounds like that, it can take time to find your home on the stage. But I realized then that that's what Gala Hispanic Theater had done for me growing up. Like, it was a place where people who were away from home had a home on the stage. So for me, the stage is home. Where people who are in exile, where people who have homes elsewhere, that's a really important part of our theater tradition here.
Thank you, Anna, for that. That was really beautiful. I'm based in Madrid right now, and what you're talking about is so interesting to me because my dad keeps insisting that I need to go to a zarzuela, not because he knows zarzuela, but because he's told me all this, by now they're kind of like family legends about all these touring companies that would come down to Honduras, where I'm from. And my great grandmother, mi bisabuela Mariana, was obsessed with zarzuela. So if you have any names of zarzuelas, Ana, that I should look out for while I'm living in Spain, I would love to know some titles.
Well, can I just say, it's amazing that your grandmother was obsessed with them because they were really cranked out. Like, a lot were written by journalists who were obviously working as journalists, but then were writing about, things that happened. Like, they were writing about current events. They were funny, but they could also be very dramatic. So anyway, this summer you have to go see La Verbena de la Paloma, and that takes place in Madrid. So just Google it. You'll see it this summer.
Thank you for that, and I promise that I will. Speaking about, the origins of all of your origin stories, what was the origin story of the musical? What planted the seed of each of the musicals that you're working on?
So for me, the musical takes place, it starts in January 2016 and ends in January 2017. So I don't know if we all remember what was happening that year, but it was quite the year. And so I think that was part of the seed of it. At 2016, not only were we dealing with obviously what was happening here in the States of the election and this unsurfacing of the amount of hate and vitriol that folks in the country have for people unlike them, non-white, straight people. And so there was definitely like a dream being broke open in that year for me of like thinking you're safe and then realizing like, oh, like whatever I thought before is not actually true. And then at the same time, the Cuba embargo was being lifted. Obama was talking about, opening up the borders more between Cuba and like and mail was finally allowed between the two countries. A lot of people planning trips back, being like, oh, maybe I can go. But then also that conflict of should I go, should I not go, considering why my family left. And then at the same time, the Syria civil war was coming to one of its worst moments of basically getting to the point where realizing that the rebels were most likely not going to be able to come to some sort of winning in that war. So I think I had all these different ideas of home. What happens when you suddenly realize your home is not safe and you can't go back? What happens when the home you're in, which technically my family as immigrants came here supposedly to be safer, you realize the home that you're at is not safe. And then what happens when your whole life you've been told that this place is not safe for you to go to. So then also this idea of like what happens when you realize you can go home. So all the characters kind of like are questioning those things throughout the piece. And that was really the seed, was my own processing of like my own home suddenly not feeling the way I thought that it should. And then just thinking about all the different levels of like time of these people.
For me, I had a professor in undergrad named Elena Maria Garcia, and she had a one-woman show called Fuacata, Latina Woman's Guide to Surviving the Universe. And in it, she played multiple characters, and one of the characters was named Marisol, and she's a person I think we're all too familiar with. She was an immigrant who came to Miami because the show was based in Miami, selling water bottles on the side of the highway. And then she just gave this like beautiful, like heartbreaking monologue about Marisol's journey. And I was sitting there in the theater and I was like, oh, Latin people can exist on stage without it having to be like a big party. We can exist in like our ugliness and our complexity as well. This is news to me. And then we went out to dinner after the show and we were just, gabbing and talking. And then I had this image of this like Latin boy like running from something. He was sort of like this. For the audio people, I'm sorry you're not going to see this, but he was kind of like that. And I was like, what is this kid running from? And then I just kept asking myself that question. And that was in 2018. So I've been working on it for a little bit. And it's really just like our culture is so deeply rooted in toxic masculinity. It's in our language. Like marica is something that a lot of people in our community, depending on where you're from, say as casually as you would say bro. And that's just an inescapable fact. And so growing up as a queer person in this community, and then coming to understand what these words mean and how this language is used so casually, either casually or like that fact of like toxic masculinity and just like what it means to be a man often just goes ignored. I was just like, why do we ignore this? Why is our culture this way? And so this piece is like putting this queer love story at the front to sort of ask questions about that and challenge that. And the world has just been getting a lot sort of wackier in a derogatory sense, I suppose, and just terrible in how politically we're sort of moving and how capitalism is destroying the planet and our communities. And then so I thought that those questions about toxic masculinity would be sort of further dramatized by placing it in this political moment, which is like, no stupid pun intended, but like black and white. And if you're not one side, then you can't sit with us. And if you're this side, you can sit with us. And it just feels like we're living in a time that sort of where the seed was planted there of like nuance not being a thing that exists in a conversation. So I wanted to sort of think about queer love through all of that perspective, and it's a comedy. So that's the gag, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, Felipe again here. I think one of my I have so many inspirations to write this story, the Divergentes story. One of them is the situation in Chile about talking about the LGBTQ plus community. The situation in Chile is like just last year they legalized the equal marriage, for example. So many people has no rights. Many people suffer the discrimination of the common people. I mean, it's something that happens in every day on the streets with comments, with I don't know. It's something that it's rooted in the blood of the culture, the Chilean culture. So I wanted to write a story that I wanted to create a story that a world that all of these situations were not a problem. You know what I mean? Where these people, which are the same people as everyone, has the same problems, could be and could live a simple life. You know what I mean? So not because you are gay or you are bi or you are trans, you're different. I mean, you are different, but in Chile is different in a bad way. You know what I mean? So you have the same feeling that me, and we are the same. So my story is a very simple story. It's an everyday story, because I think that simple idea, that simple thing is so strong because everyone could relate with that. Creo que soy un fiel defensor del idioma español y de cualquier idioma. En el fondo, si yo hablo español, yo soy defensor del español. Si alguien habla japonés, que también sea un defensor del japonés. De cada particularidad de cada lenguaje, como hablaba también Ana, los lenguajes son súper importantes, culturalmente, obviamente, y estando aquí yo sé que somos inmigrantes y que estamos en un país que se supone que habla un idioma, inglés, pero a estas alturas tenemos tanto bombardeo de cultura, de diversa cultura, que en realidad no me parece bien que solo se hagan cosas en inglés o en Spanglish a lo más. A mí me gustaría que hubiera un musical en español en Broadway. A mí me gustaría que hubiera un musical en japonés también o en portugués, no sé. Sería hermoso, sería lindo, sería algo muy, también muy, algo que rompiera barreras. Y creo que Divergente podría ser, ¿por qué no?
In 2019, Brian Ariola, who's the composer, he is a vocalist, he's a tenor, and he's a professor of opera at UNC Charlotte. He got a grant and he came to me and he said, I want to write an opera about the separation of families at the border. I only have enough money to do an hour-long piece, so it would be a chamber opera, and enough money for 3 vocalists and 5 musicians. And so that was what he presented to me. And he said, you can write anything you want, and then you pass me the libretto and I'll set it to music. So, you know, what I really wanted to write about was the legal processes of family separation. I wanted to know how words were disappearing children at the border. You know, I wanted to know how this legal machine was grinding up. Like, how is this happening, right? Like, how were lawyers defending this? How were they fighting against it? What were judges saying? Like, what was that whole legal soundscape that was allowing this to happen? And so I started to do research on it. This was 2019, and the issue had come to my knowledge in 2018, in April of 2018, when zero tolerance under Trump, you know, became publicized through the media. But I was like, well, what is the legal, you know, as I started investigating the legal conversation on the topic, I realized that this pilot program began in 2017, 2017. And so anyway, so I found this case, and I realized that in this one case that I read the proceedings of the case, that was the Zavala case, which was part of five families that were accused of illegally entering the border, and they weren't given the opportunity for asylum, so they were sent to a criminal court. So there were like all these strategies for disorienting the system in this case in El Paso in particular. And what I realized in the language of the proceedings was that Sergio Garcia, who was the lawyer, was never going to win. And there was a sense of breathlessness in the language, in the archive, like he's constantly being interrupted. He's never going to win. And that was the foundation of what the language would sound like in the piece. That this was like that was like the materiality of the archive of what I found in the proceedings. So in other words, there's one level that's like the information you're getting, what they're saying, like this word means this word means that. But then there's this other level of the human impossibility to do something. And he realizes that, and you can read that in the proceeds. So that would be the foundation of a lot of the language I use in the libretto, in addition to like interviews of people who had migrated, a lot of just like interviews of judges, interviews of lawyers, and to understand what they were going through in these processes.
I really don't know a lot about what it's like to create a musical. Obviously, all of you know, but I'm dying to hear everything about how has being a part of the Latiné Musical Theatre Lab, taught you something about your own work, and what has your experience been like? What are the tools that you got from being a part of the lab?
Well, I've only been to one lab event so far, which was when Siluetas had an excerpt read at Showcase last September, I believe it was. And what struck me from that was really just like the community. Like I think I felt very the sense of just like pride, and I felt so grateful to be in that space and to not feel like we were alone in some way, and just like excited for all the seeds that were being planted and knowing like they're all going to bloom at some point. It might be a year, it might be 10 years, it might be 5 years, but to be there at the beginning point of so many works by Latine people and knowing like this is just the beginning, it definitely felt like a moment in history, like a moment of like, we're all going to look back on this moment and remember when we were all here. And that was like when Latiné Musical Theater like was really like getting its foot and taking off in, you know, in the East Coast in general. So yeah, I would say that that's like my main takeaway from that experience. And then working with Robbie, I think has just been the best part of this experience. I have learned a lot from him, and I feel like very safe collaborating with him. So that I think has been like, I'm a playwright first. So everything I've ever written pretty much has been me by myself in a room. So having somebody else to share ideas with, to say, what about this? Or how do you feel about this? And having that back and forth with someone is like really lovely, and scary sometimes too, because there'll be moments where I'm like, oh my God, like, what if he doesn't like this idea? Or what if he gives me an idea that I don't like? And then what am I going to do with that? You know? So yeah, I think like collaborating as a creative in this way is very different and new to me and exciting. And then just also being a part of this connecting and growing community is a really exciting part of the whole thing.
Well, listen, to everybody who's out there listening, y'all got to come and see this, because it sounds like our pieces are all in conversation with each other. And that's like a really, really cool feeling. And from the lab, I mean, I really just started working with the lab. I submitted my piece way back when the submissions for this thing opened. And then I went to the first Cuatro X, as we're calling it. And I saw Café con Leche and a couple of the other pieces that they had doing there. And like, truly, I mean, I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but it was just really the community that I've observed and that I've absorbed. That's truly like what's most affecting, because I've been very fortunate with this piece Como Correr and with what it's given me in my life and where it's taken me. And it's wonderful and it's amazing, but like all of that validation has been from people outside of the community and the culture that this piece is desperate to serve, which is our culture, the Latin culture. And so to be like in this community and work with this organization, that is truly like the biggest validation and the biggest like, girl, this is working and you need to continue working on it, that I've like truly felt in like in mi corazón, de mi corazón, you know what I mean? Like, and working with Pierre Jean Gonzalez, who's going to be directing the piece for this 4x15, and he is this like Dominican queer femme, but also like femme in attitude, but mask in presentation, which I very much feel that I am. And like having him just like on our first meeting, just like shower the show's praises and just like tell me how much it's like affecting him emotionally and why he connects to not only like what the story is, but the humor and the use of like hip hop in it, and just being able to like know that the people that the show is trying to reach out to, that's happening and they're like connecting to it. I mean, that's truly what the lab has given me. And then, you know, we'll see how the production goes and then all that other jazz. But truly, I feel like my heart is just like truly been opened by the amount of support, just on a like level of that the show is working, because is giving me dividends. Is that a phrase? Because the show is very weird and it takes from like Saturday morning cartoons and hip hop and TV sitcoms and concerts and musical theater, and so it has so many reference points and it's trying to use them all to tell this love story, and to know that all of that is like coming together in a way that coalesces nicely. That's all you needed to say, and then we're gonna keep it moving.
Bueno, para mí, primero que todo, trabajar escribiendo un musical es un trabajo bien difícil porque generalmente son dos personas, en nuestro caso somos tres, entonces hay que encontrar un lenguaje común. Lo que decía Erlina, de que su partner viene con alguna idea y que a lo mejor tengo que trabajar con eso, sí, y no me gusta tanto, no sé. Entonces, todas esas cosas hay que ponerse mucho de acuerdo y hay que trabajar mucho. Entonces, ha sido un bonito proceso y los quiero nombrar porque si no me van a matar si no los nombro. Julio Vaquero, que es nuestro compositor, y Pablo Concha, quien él está asistiendo a la música y también asistiendo al book. Y creo que nosotros tres hemos tenido una gran compenetración y hemos logrado trabajar muy bien juntos. Con Latiné nos hemos sentido muy apoyados, ellos han sido muy han estado muy presentes y bien preocupados de nuestro proceso, de tratar de que todo resulte bien y de que tengamos nuestras necesidades cubiertas en el fondo, cosa que uno agradece mucho porque no se da mucho, en verdad, cosas como esa. Así que les agradezco mucho. Y nada, yo estoy demasiado contento y excitado y emocionado de lo que venga. Yo también estuve presente en la primera versión en marzo, viendo a los cuatro, a los primeros cuatro, digo. Y fue muy bonito ver toda esa energía de todas esas nuevas historias y todo, de todo eso que se genera como comunidad. Entonces, realmente estoy muy, muy emocionado de lo que pueda pasar en todo lo que resta del proceso y en la presentación misma.
Yo también diría lo mismo, comunidad y apoyo. Y yo asistí a una lectura de Anita González, que es una escritora aquí en Washington, D.C., y ella estaba leyendo Ybor City, un musical que ella ha escrito, para la cual ella ha escrito el book. Y yo quedé muy impresionada con Ryan Morales y el grupo. Y cuando vi esa invitación para mandar los musicales, yo no mandé nada porque yo dije, bueno, siento que estoy en otra categoría en cuanto a la ópera. Pero luego me dijeron, pueden mandar ópera. Así que eso me encantó y me siento muy, muy agradecida. Estaba pensando en también lo que dijo Erlina en cuanto a el espacio donde ella se encuentra cómoda escribiendo. Y para mí, a mí me encanta, y lo que han dicho ustedes también, la colaboración. Yo amo amo sentir control sobre algo y luego absolutamente dejar ir ese control y que ese diálogo con el compositor o la compositora exista en la página. Porque siempre me llama la atención que hay diferentes maneras de dialogar con otro ser humano y que muchas veces yo digo, like, talking's overrated. That's why we sing. You know, like even though I've dedicated my whole life to words, what I've realized in my age is that talking is overrated. Like sometimes you have to just not talk and go back to like co-play, you know. And so I think it's amazing that there are different forms in which we hear and know each other. And one of them is, you know, like you can express yourself in a poem in ways that you can't in a conversation, and vice versa, right? Something else happens. And so I'm really interested in that. And that's the collaborative work. And then also, like, I remember as a pianist, I would always get really nervous when I performed. Like, I loved performing, but the anxiety became overwhelming. And so I love being on a stage in a different way and like having that embodiment with other people. I feel like collaborative work is a metaphor of love and how we exist with other people. You know what I mean? Like you can love someone as much as you want and express that, but it reaches a limit in which that other person feels that. And they may not love you back. You know what I mean? Like you can't, but it's taking that risk and giving everything you, and then just leaving it out of your control. So I really, really enjoy that, and leaving it in the control of the vocalists and letting them do what they want to do with that word you wrote on the page, and letting the composer do the composer, letting the director do. Do you know what I mean? Like I feel very enjoyable. Like that's very enjoyable for me, that others have that control and their space to express themselves. And then it becomes something that's not yours. So I like that, for me, is just a metaphor for existing with other people and loving them. And so so I'm really grateful that Latiné has allowed me to be part of this.
Ana, Erlina, Felipe, and Nico, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a true pleasure. If you're listening or watching and you want to check out snippets of what these incredible people are doing in musical form, you can find information in the show notes. And in the meantime, people, break a leg, and muchísima mierda, mucha mierda para todos.
Muchas gracias y un gran abrazo, y con muchos deseos de verles todos en julio.